Are you feeling a little hollow? I know I'm feeling empty on the inside, you know, where it counts. Welcome to Jamie Dove Florida Pottery. And I gotta tell you, I love my extruder. I love it so much I even made a video about it when I first got it. But I wasn't using it to its fullest potential. I only had dies for making handles and coils. I didn't have any dies for making hollow extrusions. In today's episode, I talk about how I solved that problem and I made a hollow die for extruding tubes. I also demonstrate 2 quick and easy projects that anyone can make with extruded tubes. Check it out. The first thing I needed to do was find something that would be durable enough to make a die out of. I happen to have several white nylon cutting boards that I use around the studio as bats. I use an existing die as a reference. I also use a 4-inch hole saw and a 3.5-inch hole saw. Using the die as a template, I marked the cutting board so I could potentially cut 6 different dies out of the board. I find and mark the center of one of the squares. Using a screw and a hammer, I create a starter hole so the drill bit doesn't drift off the mark. I decide to leave the cutting board intact while I use the 4-inch hole saw to cut a groove into the board. I don't want to go all the way through just yet. Now I step down the size of the hole saw. Again, I don't drill all the way through the plastic. I flip the board over, line up the drill hole, and cut through from the back side. I saved the inside piece that I just cut out. I flip the board back over and step the hole saw size back up to the 4-inch bit. I line up the saw with the groove I cut earlier, and now I cut all the way through. I take the board to the radial arm saw, and with a few quick cuts, the die gets closer to being finished. As I continue to put the pieces together, I realized I should have used a different size hole saw for the inside cut. So I quickly cut out another die. This time, it was the appropriate size. Then I go over it all with some sandpaper to remove any burrs or plastic spirals from the cutting. The hardware I use on this project are just a couple of 1/4-inch U-bolts, some washers, and some nuts. Using a U-bolt as a reference, I marked the plastic parts accordingly. I drill holes on the marks I've just made. Now that the holes are drilled, it's time to attach the U-bolts. I begin by putting the U-bolts in the centerpiece first. Then I line up the U-bolts with the exterior piece, put the nuts on the bolts, and then tighten them down. I make sure the nuts are on tight and crank them down with wrenches. Now it's time to test my build. Is it gonna work? I stuff some clay into the extruder and load it up. I give the handle a couple of good pulls to get the clay moving, and as soon as I saw the clay coming out in a continuous tube, I was happy. It was a little thicker and not as smooth as I would have preferred, but I was still digging the fact that I just made a tube. Now that I have a tube, I have to do something with it. I cut the tube into 2 relatively equal sizes. I put one of the halves away with some other clay to be used later. For the first little project, I'm going to make a desktop or a windowsill planter. Using the PVC as a guide, I cut a pretty even line down through the clay tube, and then I removed the sliced clay. I used some clay that I'd run through the slab roller from another project. I placed the cut tube end down on the slab. Using a needle tool, I trace around the piece. I use a spatula as a straight edge to cut across the gap between the walls. I repeat this process for the opposite end. I score the edges of the end pieces with a serrated metal rib, then I rough up the ends of the tube. I add some slip to the roughed up tube, and I place the end on it firmly. I flip the piece over and let gravity help me while I put the other end on. With both end pieces on and in place, I use a wooden tool to blend the clay and to clean up the edges. I roll little coils to push into the seams and make a solid connection. I'm going to put a flanged lip on this planter, similar to the one I did in the first bonsai video. I use a piece of the unused slab from earlier. I place the planter upside down on the slab. Using a nylon die as a spacer, I go around the piece with a needle tool and mark the appropriate width for the exterior and interior edges of the rim. Using the spatula as a straight edge again, I cut and remove the excess clay. To prepare the rim for the planter, I score the underside. Then I score the top of the planter. I add some slip to the planter just before I combine the 2 parts. I line up the rim with the planter and press firmly. firmly. I use a wooden tool and a sponge to blend the clay and clean up the joint. With the rib attached, I go over the entire piece with a sponge to smooth the clay. Using the same unused slab piece, I cut 2 pieces that I will use as a base for the planter. I score the planter and add some slip. Now I attach the simple slab feet to the planter. After attaching the turtle sprigs, drilling a drainage hole, and adding my maker's mark button, this is the completed planter, which when it's done, will make a cool little tabletop planter. Now for extruder project number 2. On this project, I really didn't have any idea of what I was going to build. Looking at the size of the tube I had to work with and taking into consideration the shrink rate, I decided to make a mug completely from extruded parts. I take the part of the tube that I cut long ways and then I flatten it out. Using a part of the extruded clay tube that I cut off, I trace the interior of the tube. Using the wire cheese cutter, I cut out the piece of clay. I scored the outside edge of the slab circle with a serrated rib. Using a needle tool, I score the inside of the tube. I add some slip to the tube, then lower it down over the slab circle. I use a PVC pipe as a form so I can provide some resistance when I blend the clay. Using a wooden tool, I blend and smooth the clay. I use the base of a rubber mallet handle to compress and smooth the clay on the inside of the mug. I cut a slice off one of the spare tubes that I had. It kind of made a ring. Well, then I took a chunk out of the middle, making it look kind of like a Pac-Man. Actually, it looked more like a handle shape. Using a fettling knife, I clean up the rough edges on the handle before I attach it to the mug. This makes smoothing it out once it's attached a lot easier. I scored the handle and the cylinder thoroughly with a needle tool. Then I add a little slip to the scored clay on the mug. I press the handle into the cylinder firmly. I add additional clay to the join to make it stronger. Using a wooden tool, I blend and smooth the clay around the handle. The sign of life and the staff of Asclepius. I got this cookie cutter a while back and I've never done anything with it. I press the cookie cutter into the clay, but not enough to go all the way through. I use a fettling knife to trim the excess clay away from the piece. I take the slab cut out and I press it gently over a piece of PVC pipe to give it a curve before attaching it to the mug. Clay has a memory and it will want to go back to being flat. On larger, flat attachments, I like to train the clay over something curved. After scoring the clay and adding some slip to the roughed area, I attach the sign of life. I attach a cool little thumb rest with a little heart stamp in it, and I also attach my maker's mark button on the back. Here are the 2 quick hand-built projects I made from an extruded tube. The projects have 2 totally different purposes, but they have 2 things in common. 1, the love of warm s'mores over a campfire, and 2, they were both made from extruded cylinders. It was fun making those little projects, but the bigger takeaway here is that anyone can make a hollow die for an extruder with very inexpensive parts. A couple of bucks for U-bolts and nuts, and I think I might have paid $2 for 3 cutting boards at a yard sale. I cut one of those into a bunch of pieces, and in the future I'll be playing with some dies and doing some die making and coming up with some cool things to extrude. I'll definitely have to shoot that as a video. If you enjoyed the video and you found it helpful, hit like. Share the video with someone who could benefit from it. Leave a comment if you have a question or you want to see me demonstrate something. And once again, thank you very much for watching the video. Go have fun. Go play in the clay. Take care.